Celestial Codex, an epic novel in 3 parts based on the story Stella and the Extraterrestrial, inspired by the great tradition of Jules Verne, George MacDonald, E. Nesbit, Lewis Carroll, and the narrative craft of J.K. Rowling. T. Lot, Creative Artistry Store.com, MMXXVI. A note on sources and inspirations: this novel began as a children's adventure and became, through careful study and expansion, an attempt at something more lasting. In transforming the original tale of Stella and Zoe, the author drew on a tradition of epic adventure storytelling stretching across centuries and genres. From Project Gutenberg's vast archive, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea supplied the model of a young person encountering impossible marvels and insisting on understanding them scientifically. George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin offered the template of the courageous child who descends into danger not through recklessness but through clear-eyed determination. E. Nesbit's The Railway Children provided the understanding that the deepest adventures are always, at their core, about the people you come back to. From J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, 7 volumes that changed the grammar of how the modern world tells children's stories, came the structural architecture of this novel, the hero's journey as refined and humanized by a writer of extraordinary gifts. The understanding that high stakes and genuine emotion are not intention but are, in fact, the same thing, and the simple, radical belief that a child can be the hero of a story that matters to the entire world. The Codex lines are fictional. The belief that the world is held together by invisible connections that most of us cannot see, and that the work of a life is to tend those connections faithfully, that the author submits, is not fictional at all. Prologue: The dreaming city, 20,000 leagues the sea may run, yet the heart of the brave runs deeper still. Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Before the story began, before the first word was spoken into the dark between the stars, there existed a city that should not have been possible. Its name was Lomaville. It floated above the earth like a thought held just at the edge of waking, suspended within a great sphere of living energy that pulsed with the slow, rhythmic breath of something ancient and aware. Its towers were built of crystallized light. Its streets wound like rivers of silver through plazas where children played beneath skies that changed color with the turning of the tide. No one in Lomaville had ever questioned why it floated. Some things, the elders said, are sustained not by reason but by belief. Underneath it all, woven into the very lattice of the city's impossible foundations, ran the Codex lines, invisible threads of cosmic energy that connected Lomaville to every corner of the known and unknown universe. The scholars called them arteries. The children called them singing roads. Only one person in all of Lomaville's recorded history had ever seen them with her own eyes. Her name was Stella Voss, and she was 12 years old, and she was about to change everything. Part 1: The Ordinary World. It is a curious thing, Harry, but perhaps those who are best suited to power are those who have never sought it. J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Chapter 1: The girl who saw lines. She had golden hair, not the golden hair that is only called so by courtesy, but real golden hair, as golden as the sun. George MacDonald, The Princess and the Goblin. The morning Stella Voss found the alien in the wildflower field, she had already been awake for 3 hours, which was unusual only in that it was a Saturday. Stella was not the kind of child who slept late. She was, according to her teachers, extraordinarily attentive, which was the polite way of saying she noticed everything, including things that weren't there. She noticed the faint blue shimmer that clung to the walls of old buildings at dusk. She noticed the way certain shadows moved half a heartbeat too slowly. She noticed the lines. No one else could see the Codex lines. She had tried, once, to describe them to her mother, thin threads of light, silver and gold, and sometimes a deep, aching violet, woven through the air like the strings of an instrument no human hand had ever played. Her mother had smiled and called it an artist's imagination. Stella had never mentioned them again. Lumaville in the summer was a city of open windows and distant laughter, of vendors selling sunfruit at corners that smelled of warm stone. Stella moved through it like a cartographer making private notes. She wore her golden hair in a single braid she forgot to finish every morning. She carried, always, a worn leather notebook stuffed with sketches, of the lines, of the shapes they made above doorways and beneath bridges, of the patterns she was beginning, slowly, to understand. The wildflower field lay at the city's eastern edge, where the energy sphere grew thin enough to see the clouds below. It was Stella's thinking place. She came here when the lines grew too bright and the world felt too loud, and she would sit among the tall emerald grass and the yellow-white blooms and breathe. She almost missed him entirely. He was smaller than she expected, though she had never quite expected anything like this. He was the color of new leaves after rain, a luminescent green that seemed to shift and deepen as the light moved across him. His eyes were very large and the exact shade of a nebula she had once seen in an astronomy text, swirling purples and soft glowing golds. Two delicate antennas rose from his temples, curving slightly, trembling with what Stella would later understand was not anxiety but curiosity so acute it registered in his body like a vibration. He was sitting very still in a hollow between the roots of a silver-barked tree, watching her with an expression that was, unmistakably, wonder. Stella sat down. She did not run. She did not scream. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and said, very carefully, "Hello. My name is Stella Voss. What's yours?" The creature blinked. Then, in a voice like starlight translated into sound, warm and slightly astonished, it said, "I am called Zoe. And I have been waiting, Stella Voss, for you specifically." Chapter 2 The Visitor from the Outer Spirals. They think me mad because I will not sell my days for gold, and I think them mad because they think my days have a price. Khalil Gibran, the prophet Zoe was, as he explained in the careful, precise way of someone who had rehearsed an important speech, a luminary, one of a small and ancient civilization who lived in the outer spirals of the galaxy, beyond the range of any human telescope. "We are listeners," he said, his antennas tilting forward with scholarly enthusiasm. "We map the Codex lines across the universe. We have been mapping the lines that run through Lumaville for 400 of your years." He paused. "You are the first resident who has ever been able to see them." Stella wrote this down. Then she looked up. "Is that why you're here? Because I can see the lines?" "Partly." Zoe's expression shifted, something serious moving through those nebula eyes. "The lines are changing, Stella. For the first time in 4 centuries, they are fraying. If the codex that sustains your city loses coherence," he gestured delicately toward the great luminous sphere of energy that held Lumaville aloft, "the consequences will extend far beyond this city. The lines connect everything. A break in one thread pulls at all the others. The morning had grown very quiet around them. Even the insects in the wildflowers seemed to pause. "Can it be fixed?" Stella asked. "It can be rewoven, but only by someone who can see it." Zoe looked at her with that enormous, steady gaze. "The Luminary Council has searched for 3 generations. We found you." Stella closed her notebook. She thought of her mother, who would be making breakfast. She thought of her teachers, who praised her attentiveness and meant it as a compliment about small things. She thought of the lines, how they had always been there, just beyond the edge of what the world thought was real, singing to her in frequencies no one else could hear. "All right," she said. "Tell me everything." Chapter 3 The Reckoning of the Drought Science is nothing but trained and organized common sense. T.H. Huxley, Collected Essays. The first test came not from a prophecy or a villain's decree but from something older and more indifferent than any of those things, thirst. The village of Solon Reach clung to the southern underside of Lumoval's sphere like a barnacle on the hull of a ship, visible from the city above only as a cluster of amber lights when the night was clear. It had once been wealthy in water. 3 underground rivers had run beneath it for as long as memory could reach. Then the Codex lines in that region had begun to fray, and the rivers had quietly, inexplicably, run dry. Stella saw it first in the lines. Standing at the field's edge, she watched the silver threads that wound towards Solon Reach pull taut with the particular tension she had begun to recognize as distress, like a wire about to snap, vibrating at a frequency just below the range of ordinary hearing. "The atmospheric moisture in this corridor is dense," Zoe observed, studying the readout on a small crystalline instrument he kept in a satchel the color of midnight. "Suspended water molecules, dispersed but recoverable. If the extraction protocol I've been developing, build it," Stella said. "Show me how." What followed was 3 days that Stella would later rank among the most instructive of her life, not because of what she learned from Zoe's alien physics, though that knowledge would prove invaluable, but because of what she learned about the nature of real work, that it is slow and frustrating and punctuated by failures that feel like indictments of your entire intelligence, and that it proceeds anyway. The atmospheric extractor they finally produced was no larger than a suitcase. It ran on the ambient energy of the nearest Codex line. Stella placed her hand against it and felt it hum to life beneath her palm, the line recognizing her the way a lock recognizes its key. When they carried it into the central square of Solon Reach and set it running, it wept clean water from the air at a rate of 40 liters an hour. The sound the villagers made when the first stream ran clear, that collective exhale, that sound beneath words, was the sound Stella would carry inside her like a compass bearing for the rest of her life. An old woman pressed both of Stella's hands between hers and said nothing for a long time. "Then, you have your whole life still in front of you, child. Spend it like this." Stella looked at Zoe, who was watching with those ancient nebula eyes. She thought, "I intend to." Chapter for the school beneath the sphere. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. W.B. Yeats. There was a school in the lower quarter of Lumoval that had given up on itself. Not all at once, that is never how institutions die, but by increments, like a fire going out one ember at a time. The teachers were exhausted. The students were bored in the specific way that is indistinguishable from hopelessness. The textbooks were decades old and wrong about half the things they stated with the greatest confidence. Stella had attended this school. She knew its particular hollowness. The holographic learning system she and Zoe devised over 2 weeks of late nights was not, in principle, complicated. Zoe contributed the projection technology. Stella contributed something more elusive but equally essential. She understood what it felt like to be a child who needed to see a thing in order to believe it was real. The result was extraordinary. Not because it was miraculous. There was nothing magic about solid-state photon emitters and precision-mapped educational content, but because it was true. When the holographic image of a cell membrane rotated in the center of the classroom, the students didn't just see it. They reached for it. They argued about it. 2 students who had not spoken to each other in a year of shared classroom found themselves on the same side of a debate about protein synthesis and forgot, for a while, that they were supposed to be strangers. A boy named Cassiel, who had been told he was too slow to learn and had begun to believe it, spent 40 minutes with his face pressed close to a 3-dimensional map of the Roman aqueduct system. Then he looked up and said, with a precision and confidence that silenced the room, "They solved the pressure problem the same way we solved the drought. They used what was already there." Stella wrote it down. She wrote everything down. Change, she was learning, did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, in the unremarkable moment when a child who had been told he couldn't discovers that he can. Part 2. The deepening dark it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live. J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Chapter 5. The unraveling things without all remedy should be without regard. William Shakespeare, Macbeth. The Codex lines did not break all at once. They frayed. Stella noticed it first as color. The silver-gold threads she had always known began to shade towards something darker at their edges, a deep, bruised violet that was not the beautiful violet of Zoe's eyes but something duller, like a bruise on living tissue. The lines that had always sung in harmonics she couldn't quite name had begun, in certain places, to buzz. A frequency lower and less clean. The sound of a system under strain. "How long?" she asked Zoe. They were standing at the highest accessible point of Lumoval's eastern spire, looking out across the energy sphere. Even to eyes that couldn't see the lines, something was wrong. The sphere's usual warm luminescence had taken on a faint, irregular quality, like a lamp behind smudged glass. Without intervention? The central meridian lines will begin separating within 60 days. Zoe's voice was steady in the way that is very deliberate and costs something. When the meridians go, the sphere loses coherence at the poles first. Then the rest follows. 60 days. The word pressed itself against the inside of Stella's chest like a thumb against a bruise. She had read about what happened when floating cities fell. There were accounts in the historical archives, ancient cities from before Lumoval that had lost their sustaining energies. The accounts were fragmentary and not good reading. "There's something else," Zoe said. He did not look at her when he said it, which meant it was serious. "I've been tracking the pattern of the fraying. It isn't random. The lines are being pulled. Something, or someone, is drawing energy from them deliberately. The fraying isn't decay. It's drainage." The word fell into the silence between them. Drainage. Someone was eating the city alive, one invisible thread at a time. "Then we find them," Stella said. Her voice did not shake. She was surprised to discover she meant it. "We find them, and we make them stop." Chapter 6: The Keeper of the Cracked Mirror. It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. His name was Aldrich Sorn, and he had been draining the Codex lines for 11 years. He was not, when Stella finally found him, what she had expected a villain to look like. He was old and small and lived in a cottage at the fog-wrapped edge of the sphere that smelled of cold tea and old sorrow. His eyes had the clouded quality of something that had looked too long at things it could not reach. He kept a cracked mirror on the wall above a fireplace he never lit. He did not run when Stella and Zoe arrived. He simply looked at Stella, really looked, with the assessing gaze of someone seeing a thing they had been told was impossible, and said, "You can see them, then." The lines. "Yes." "I couldn't." He turned back to the mirror. "I was a Codex scholar for 40 years. The lines were the only thing I ever truly wished to see. And they were invisible to me. So I found another way to know them." A long pause. "I learned to take them apart." It was not an excuse. He did not present it as one. It was simply a fact about what grief and longing, left unwitnessed long enough, could become. Stella stood in the doorway of his cold cottage and felt something she had not expected, the ache of understanding. She did not excuse what he had done. Solon reaches dried rivers, the dimming sphere above a city of people who had no idea how fragile the ground beneath them had grown. But she understood the shape of the wound that had led here. "Can you stop?" she asked. Not commanding. Asking. The old man was quiet for a very long time. His cracked mirror caught the faint winter light and scattered it across the floor in fractured pieces. "If you can show me," he said slowly, "what they look like. The lines. If you can describe them to me, finally, as they really are," his voice broke very slightly, "then yes. I think I could stop." Stella sat down at his table. She took out her notebook. And she began to describe, in the most precise and loving detail she had ever used for anything, what the Codex lines looked like from where she stood. Chapter 7: Into the Mythic Dark. Courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point. C.S. Lewis, the screwtape letters reweaving the Codex lines was not a metaphor. It was not symbolic. It was work, hard, specific, exhausting work that required Stella to spend 14 hours a day for 3 weeks in a state of focused attention she had never previously imagined her mind capable of sustaining. The process, as Zoe had designed it based on 1,000 years of luminary technique and the singular fact that Stella could actually see what she was touching, involved placing her hands against the fraying threads of the Codex and drawing them back together. It felt like pressing a wound closed. The lines resisted, at first, the way a torn muscle resists being asked to flex, not from malice but from damage, from the memory of breaking. Aldrich Sorn, to his credit, kept his word. He stopped draining. He went further than that, in the careful, penitent way of someone trying to return what they have taken. He spent those 3 weeks channeling back into the lines every fragment of energy he had extracted and stored across 11 years of quiet, desperate theft. It was not enough. Nothing he could give back would equal what had been lost to time and entropy, but it helped. The creatures of the outer reaches came after the 5th day. They were real. Stella had not quite believed in them until the first one stepped out of the fog at the sphere's boundary, vast and ancient, a thing built of shadow and the deep pressure of the spaces between stars, its form shifting like smoke, its attention as heavy as gravity. The histories called them veil folds. The histories suggested avoiding them. Stella did not avoid this one. She walked toward it, hands open, heart thundering in her chest, and she said, "I can see the lines. Show me where the worst damage is." The veilfold regarded her for a long, geological moment. Then it bent, not in submission, but in the specific acknowledgement of one entity recognizing another as genuine, and it showed her. She worked through the night, and the night after that. She wept once, when a thread she had almost restored finally snapped entirely and she had to begin again. Zoe sat beside her and did not say it was all right, because it wasn't, and he knew she would not be consoled by comfortable lies. Again, Stella said, wiping her face. She put her hands back on the lines. "Show me where again." Part 3: The Return. It matters not what someone is born, but what they grow to be. J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Chapter 8: The Morning the Lines Sang. The sea is everything. It covers 7/10 of the terrestrial globe, a supernatural and wonderful existence. Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The morning the Codex lines sang, Stella was asleep. She had been awake for 31 hours. She had finally closed her eyes somewhere in the small hours, curled against the roots of the silver-barked tree in the wildflower field, her notebook tucked under her head as a pillow. Zoe had draped his traveling cloak over her, a thing that smelled of elsewhere and kept the cold out with quiet efficiency, and settled nearby to keep watch. She did not hear the singing begin. She dreamed it first. In the dream, she was standing in the middle of a vast dark space, and the lines were all around her, not fraying, not buzzing with the low frequency of distress, but whole. Luminous. Singing in the harmonics she had always half heard at the edges of sleep. Silver and gold and the deep aching violet, all in their proper tension, pulling against each other with the productive resistance of things that are meant to be connected. When she woke, the song was real. She sat up. The field around her was lit differently, not with the faint, uneven quality of a compromised sphere, but with the clear, warm, steady light of a system restored. Above Lumaville, the energy dome rang like a crystal struck precisely by a knowing hand. And in the air, visible now not just to Stella but as a faint shimmer detectable by anyone who stopped and looked, the lines. Faint, barely perceptible, but there. Did that, she stopped. She pressed her hands against the nearest thread of light and felt it resonate under her palms, whole and humming. Did it work? Zoe was smiling, his full expression, the one that made his antennas spread wide with delight and his nebula eyes go bright as new stars. The meridian lines are stable. The polar anchors are holding. The drainage reversal is holding. He paused. Stella. It worked. She sat in the wildflowers for a long time after that, her hands in the grass, feeling the earth hung with the lines running through it. She was 12 years old. She was exhausted in a way that felt clean, like the exhaustion after building something. She was, underneath the tiredness and the long ache of weeks of impossible work, something she did not yet have an adequate word for. She would find the word later. The word was ready. Chapter 9: The Old Man's Garden. Not all those who wander are lost. J.R.R. Tolkien. The Fellowship of the Ring. 3 months after the lines were restored, Stella went back to find Aldrich Sorn. She was not sure, entirely, why. He had done what he said he would do, returned the energy, held his hands away from the lines, kept the agreement they had made across his kitchen table in the cold cottage. She owed him nothing more than she had already given him, the description, the true description, of what the Codex lines looked like. She found him in a garden she had not known existed behind the cottage. He was planting something, his hands in the dark earth, moving with the careful patience of someone learning a skill late but learning it honestly. "I couldn't see them while I was draining them," he said without looking up. "I thought that was the point. That taking them apart was the way to finally understand them." He sat back on his heels. "I was wrong about the method. I was right about the wanting. There is nothing wrong with wanting to understand beautiful things." Stella crouched down beside the nearest plant, something she didn't recognize, with leaves the color of copper. "What are you growing?" "Whatever will grow." He looked at her for the first time. In 3 months, something had shifted in his face, not youth returning, nothing so dramatic as that, but the specific quality of a man who has put something down that was very heavy. "I understand I owe that village water. I have been speaking with the engineers. There are things I know about the subsurface geology from 4 decades of Codex study. Ways the rivers might be redirected." A pause. "It will take years." "Good," Stella said. "I'll check back." She did check back. She checked back for the rest of his life, and after every visit she wrote in her notebook, the state of the garden, the progress of the rivers, the way a person could grow while they were growing old, given sufficient reason and enough dirt. Chapter 10: The Misfits of the Lower Quarter. All the darkness in the world cannot extinguish the light of a single candle. St. Francis of Assisi. The group called themselves, without any apparent irony, the Unmapped. They met in a basement beneath a closed bookshop in the lower quarter, and they were 6 in number, and they were, collectively, the strangest collection of people Stella had ever encountered in one place. There was Fun, who could hear frequencies above the range of human hearing and had been told all her life that her sensitivity was a disorder. There was the brothers Cass and Lowen, who communicated in a private language of gesture and half-sentences that had developed between them over 17 years of being close enough to share thoughts. There was Meridian, who was brilliant and socially unreadable and had stopped trying to explain herself to people who weren't going to understand. There was Dov, who had grown up on the sphere's underside and spoke of his village the way you speak of a country that doesn't exist on maps. And there was Pell, who was 14 and had decided, after a lifetime of being told his difference was a problem, that the problem was the assessment. Zoe had found them, or rather, Zoe had detected the faint codex resonance that particularly attentive human nervous systems produced, and had followed it like a signal, and had found 6 young people sitting in a basement arguing passionately about the nature of things. Stella sat with them for an entire afternoon. She said very little, she listened. She listened the way she had learned to listen to the lines, with full attention, without deciding in advance what she expected to hear. What she heard was people who had been told they were wrong about themselves, discovering in each other that the assessment was incorrect. By the end of the afternoon, the unmapped had become 7. Stella did not tell them what she could do with the lines. She told them something more useful, that the part of themselves they had been taught to see as the problem was, in fact, the most interesting part. Pell, who had not spoken for the first 2 hours, finally said, "Do you actually believe that? I found an alien in a wildflower field and used his technology to reweave the energy lattice that holds this entire city in the sky," Stella said. "I believe almost anything is possible if you look at it correctly." It was the truest thing she had ever said. She wrote it down on the way home. Chapter 11. The Choral Record. The sea never changes, and its works, for all the talk of men, are wrapped in mystery. Joseph Conrad, Typhoon, and Other Stories. The marine station beneath the sphere's southern edge was the most beautiful building Stella had ever worked in, a glass dome pressed against the underside of the energy boundary, filled with the blue-green light of the ocean below. The researchers who lived there were gentle and fiercely committed and had been studying the coral reef system for 15 years and were terrified of what they were finding. Zoe dived with them. This was the part of his brief that he executed with particular enthusiasm. He was, it emerged, a gifted underwater cartographer. With Stella on the surface analyzing the Codex data that corresponded to the reef's position, and Zoe in the water documenting the reef's present state with his crystalline recording instruments, they produced within 6 days a map of the damage and a preliminary model of the recovery conditions that the researchers had not been able to generate in 2 years of standard methods. The lead researcher, a quiet woman named Dr. Calloway, reviewed the model for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "This suggests the reef can recover. Not easily, and not fast, but substantially. We haven't been able to say that until now." "The lines run through it," Stella said. "The reef is anchored to 3 Codex meridians. They're stable now. The conditions for recovery exist." Dr. Calloway looked at her. "How old are you?" 12. A pause. "Right." Dr. Calloway turned back to the model. "In that case, we have a lot of work to do." Chapter 12. What the robot learned. The greatest good you can do for another is not just to share your riches but to reveal to him his own. Benjamin Disraeli, the blind woman who lived at the sphere's northern edge, was 91 years old and had not left her cottage in 2 years. Her name was Vera, and she was not, she made clear within the first 5 minutes of their acquaintance, interested in sympathy. "I need groceries," she said, "not sentiment. If you have a practical solution, stay. If you have a lot of feelings about my situation, close the door on your way out." Stella stayed. Zoe's robotic assistant, built over a weekend from salvaged components and Luminari microprocessors, was not elegant. It was functional in the way that Stella had come to prefer, dependably, without drama, in the service of specific problems. It navigated the market with a precision that improved over 3 weeks as it learned Vera's preferences. It read aloud from her archive of books without the slight pauses and self-conscious performances that had marked the reading of every volunteer who had come before. But the thing that mattered most, the thing Vera mentioned 6 weeks later, almost as an aside, as if it were a small thing, was this: it doesn't pity me. I can't hear pity in its voice, because it has no pity and no contempt. It is simply present. You would be surprised how rare that is. Stella wrote it down, simply present. It is simply present. She thought about this for a long time afterward, about the nature of help, and the ways in which the impulse to help is so often contaminated by the feelings of the helper, and what it might mean to offer assistance that was clean of all that. She thought about the lines, which sustained the city without requiring gratitude or understanding or any acknowledgement at all. They simply held. They simply ran. She thought, there is a kind of love that looks like that. Epilogue: the city of lines, for in dreams we enter a world that is entirely our own. J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. The year Stella Voss turned 20, the Luminary Council invited her to address the Outer Spiral Assembly, the gathering of all species who studied and maintained the Codex lines across the known galaxy. She stood before them, hundreds of delegates, each as different from the others as Zoe was from herself, each attending to the lines in their own way across distances she still could not entirely comprehend, and she thought about what to say. She thought about Solon Reach, and the sound the villagers made when the water ran clean. She thought about Cassiel, who had looked at an aqueduct and seen a solution. She thought about Aldrich Sorn, kneeling in his garden with his hands in the earth. She thought about the unmapped, arguing in their basement, keeping each other company in the specific loneliness of being different. She thought about Vera, who wanted presence, not pity. She thought about the reef, recovering. She thought about the morning the lines sang. I can see the Codex lines, she said. I have seen them all my life. I want to tell you what they look like. She spoke for an hour. She described the silver and gold and the deep aching violet. She described the way they hummed when they were healthy and buzzed when they were strained. She described the morning she sat in the wildflowers and heard them sing, and the long weeks of work before that morning, and all the people who had been connected to the lines without knowing it, holding water for a village, or holding knowledge for a child, or holding time in a garden, or simply being present in a room. She described the way everything is connected to everything else by threads that most people cannot see, and the way the work of a life, if you do it honestly and without requiring it to announce itself as important, is the work of tending those threads. The lines sustain us, she said. We can sustain each other in the same way. Quietly. Steadily. Without requiring gratitude. Simply present. Simply holding. When she finished, Zoe, who had sat in the third row with his antennas spread wide and his nebula eyes very bright, leaned toward the delegate beside him and said, quietly, I told you she was exactly right for this. The delegate, who was 300 years old and had heard many speeches, said, yes. You were correct. Zoe nodded. He was not surprised. He had known, from the moment he found her in the wildflower field, a girl with golden hair and a worn notebook and the rare, unmistakable quality of someone who pays full attention, that the story beginning here was one worth waiting 400 years for. And he had been right.